Hi, welcome to the live panel on open source versus commercial tools. I'm Terry Slattery, Principal Architect at NetCraftsmen. I primarily work on network automation and network management. And today with me, I have four panelists to talk about open source versus commercial tools. Samir, Parikh, Head of Product at Intentionet, Mike Haugh, VP of Product Marketing at Gluware, Brad Thornton, Lead Architect at Red Hat, and Daren Fulwell, Network Automation Evangelist. Boy, that's a mouthful, at IP Fabric. welcome, folks.
Thanks, Terry.
Thanks, Terry. Good to be here.
So we have a whole set of questions here. We're going to go through these. That'll give us a kind of an idea of what the difference is between open source and commercial tools. So the first question, how important is the cost comparison, and is there a significant difference between them? So I'm going to start with Samir. Please tell us what your opinion is on that.
I think for any initiative, cost comparisons are important. I think when people are evaluating open source versus commercial, you got to look at the total cost of ownership. You know, with open source, you can build a lot of the tooling yourself, but there's a cost to that in terms of your internal headcount and your time and the opportunity cost. So it's just important to factor that in when you're evaluating open versus closed source. It's really about figuring out the total cost and what has the functionality you need.
Correct. Brad?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think what's interesting about this question is, I think in my mind, it's less about the cost of the tool itself, the commercial offering of the tool or the open source tool. I think it's really cost for commercial support. And that's a question that every enterprise needs to ask themselves. Are they going to staff up internally to support the open source tools? Or are they going to find support like you would with Red Hat for Ansible? There's going to be, if you go down this network automation journey, there are costs. They either come in the cost of staffing, outsourcing, or commercial support. So I think the question really is, do you want to build the expertise and pay for support so you've got it 24/7, need it in the middle of the night? Or are you going to staff for that internally?
Right, and I think the analysis that I've done on this subject is you take a look at the cost of staffing yourself and you start adding up the number of people that you need in order to make it an open source, internally developed project work versus what it costs to go out and buy something. And I think you'll find that the cost difference for total cost of ownership is not that great. So the next question, let's factor in the time of implementation. So an open source thing may take a while, whereas a commercial product, you may be able to just drop that in pretty quickly. Does this drive customers to one approach versus another? So Daren, let's start with you.
Well, I think it obviously feeds straight off the previous question, really, doesn't it? Because it's often a resourcing issue of whether you've got the capability to develop the open source solution as opposed to just dropping the commercial tooling in. The open source, obviously great for if you're just deploying as a tactical point solution. That time to implement can be nice and quick. But you've got the possibility of complex installation. You've got skills requirements there that you may need training up, and so the time taken is less predictable, should we say? I think is fair. But with the commercial solution, you've then got the problem of, is it a strategic solution? Is there some sort of agreement within the business to invest the time that you need to go ahead and do that installation? Is it a packaged install? Is it simple to configure through a GUI? There's so many variables there. I think that again, you'll probably find time-wise they probably even out, but I think it's more about the appetite for dedicating resource to it.
Absolutely. Mike?
Yeah, I'll build off what Daren said, and I fully agree. It's the company's kind of appetite for kind of building up a team that can deliver. But what we've found, being Gluware is a company that delivers commercial automation, is sometimes there's a plan in place, and then all of a sudden there's a strategic need that comes up. And it just kind of throws the plan out the window, and due to executive management or some decision, they said, we have to get this done. One of our success stories was from a global pharmaceutical. NotPetya hit them, and then all of a sudden they had to move things to the cloud much faster than they originally planned. So the build it yourself plan was going to take too long. An outsourced plan was still going to take too long. they started looking at the tooling they had in place. They found us. We're able to help them implement and test and get deployed in under 2 months. So sometimes it's about where's the pain and what can get you to that point first. And even if you're going down a path of a build your own and you're staffing up, sometimes you've got to just get to the business deliverable sooner than later, and ultimately it may drive you towards a commercial solution.
Right. And the other factor to go in with that is, what are the requirements for your deployment? What do you need? So that needs to be factored in there as well. It's not just about time to implementation and how much does it cost. It's what are the requirements, and do you have the appropriate resources available that understand how to take an open source package and deploy it versus a commercial package. Now, yeah, you may also have to put out some more money or resources in terms of taking that commercial product and get it installed on site and get trained on it. So don't overlook things like that. So let's move on. So what staff expertise and education is required, and is outsourcing viable? So let's go back to Brad and start with him on that.
Yeah, in the case of, and I think this is common for most of the automation platforms, understanding what a YAML file is and serialization of data into YAML, working with structured data. Network engineers, I think we've come a long way in understanding structured data compared to CLI. 5 years ago, it was very different. You're going to end up doing some templating for configuration. So Jinja comes into play here. Interacting with REST APIs, as soon as you need to start pulling data from other systems within the enterprise to do network automation, REST APIs are going to be critical. It could be an inventory source, could be an IPAM system, could be a CMDB, and those are typically going to have an API interface. In terms of skills, as you progress around this journey, at least with Ansible, Python is going to help you out, especially when you start developing your own inventory sources, or you want to extend Ansible in a different manner.
Okay, let's go back to Mike. Mike, do you have a comment on this?
This one's kind of close to home for me, because I grew up as a network engineer and built the protocol skill sets and the vendor CLI skill sets, and 20 years into a career, was doing a lot of that kind of work, and I talked to a lot of network engineers that followed that same path. I made a decision pretty early on, like computer science wasn't my strength, but understanding protocols, implementing networking was. So I think what you have in a lot of these teams, especially when you look at network engineering, NetOps, is you have a lot of folks who get skill set in vendor implementations of protocols and CLI. And when I think it was Cisco Live a few years ago, Terry, you were probably there, they got up on stage and said, all network engineers have to become programmers. That's kind of a scary thought. And so what that brings it back to me is, there's usually a subset of the network engineers on staff that have interest in it and have a passion, or following industry trends and begin to self-learn. So they pick up a language like Python, they pick up Ansible and some playbooks, and they can get some things moving. But just like Brad was saying, pretty quickly, you go from a little bit of YAML and a little bit of Python to a templating language, and then RESTful APIs, and it's a whole world in and of itself. And so if you're going down that path and you want to make enterprise quality automation, meaning you're going to take this project that you develop with your own code and maybe some open source pieces, and you're going to press the button to deploy on an enterprise network, if it's making changes, you better be darn confident in your skill set to do that. I think one of the things you run into with is that if you really go through the good hygiene a software developer has, they really have to test and maintain that code. And I think people overestimate, or I should say underestimate, the skill set it takes to become an efficient developer, to consume the open source tools and build up that skill set. I think what maybe, where there's commercial tools that have a little bit of that skill set exposed, like regex and maybe some conditionals and a little bit of programming, I think a network engineer, network architect, or ops person could more easily consume. So I think it's a lot asking, let's say, all your network engineers or ops persons to be programming savvy.
Yeah, one of the interesting things that I've written about, because I do a fair amount of writing on the subject, is back in the day when, like, Michael and I went to school on networking and network equipment, what we did is we taught people how to use the CLI and configure one box at a time. And we just, that was the paradigm. You sat down with 5 boxes and you figured out how to do a network. We never learned how to scale this up and make it work for a large number of systems at the same time. And I've actually had some network engineers tell me, hey, I got into networking because I didn't really care for software and I didn't care for software development processes and things like that. So it's really interesting. And one of the ways that you can actually take your network engineers, which are still critical because you have to understand how the network is going to react to changes, and you have to understand those protocols and how they work, is pair them up with a programmer. So now you have 2 people. You have the software expertise and you have the network expertise working as a pair, and they check each other. And they'll cross speed each other. They'll learn from each other. So I think that's a key thing there. The other characteristic here is that outsourcing is viable. You can outsource to companies that take care of the open source packages and understand how to do them. But then does that really wind up being much more like a commercial package? Depends on the organization. So let's move on. So describe the target customer. Is it the network engineer, or is it DevOps, or is it network automation engineers? Who's the target customer for both open source and for commercial? So Daren, let's go with you.
Well, I think you've already started down that path with the previous question, really. But I think my take on this is a little bit different. I think you've already said about the network engineer and not wanting to learn programming, and so many of us have went through that programming thing at college and university and binned it off because networking was far more interesting, and now we're here, right? But I think the way I like to think of it is that a network engineer is more like a data scientist, right? What they're doing is they're learning to use the tools that are available to them and the data sources that are in the network in order to get the job done, right? So they're not going to be a software developer. They're going to be a network data scientist, and I think that's drives us in a bit more of a direction to answer your question, because really what the network engineer is after is the information about their network to help troubleshooting, that standardized and templated approach to help delivery, and I think you get that through commercial tooling for the sort of detailed analysis and the troubleshooting. But the key is the vendor specific stuff, right? There's no escaping the fact that to get the full troubleshooting information you need to the detail you need, you often have to resort to the vendor tooling to do that. And I think that's where, particularly in software defined and the controller aspects of automation, you can't avoid that. If you then turn to DevOps and those sorts of scenarios, what those guys are doing is consuming network services and building stuff into pipelines for orchestration. And again, they're going to use the vendor tooling in order to do stuff, but they're also going to use an open source approach and a framework to wrap that up. So they're able to almost pick and choose. And then, of course, you've got the network automation engineer who's kind of sat between the two, really, and neither a DevOps or a software developer or a network engineer. They're there really trying to integrate the whole of the operational ecosystem. So they're there thinking about APIs, thinking about the orchestration, but also being able to tap into, we've already mentioned, CMDBs and monitoring platforms and automation tooling in order to build a full scenario. So again, it's both, right? It's commercial because the commercial elements do what the commercial elements do, but it's open source in order to build the frameworks and be able to make things more extensible and modular, in my opinion.
Okay, thank you. Samir?
I mean, I think you hit on this a little bit, Terry. Like at the end of the day, when it comes to network automation, whether it's open source or commercial tooling, the target customer is not a single persona, right? Because it's impossible for any enterprise to adopt network automation with a single sort of target persona that's going to implement it. Because you have to have sort of solid networking expertise to understand how the pieces come together. So you understand how do you build the templates that are going to be driven by a playbook or a Python script, to define what YAML inputs need to be there, to create the configurations, to interact with the SDN controller APIs. And then you need somebody that's going to write the logic to actually implement this, that's going to write the logic that says, okay, this is what I'm going to deploy, but can also figure out what happens if something went wrong. How do I back out of it? And then there's going to be somebody that has to maintain these pipelines and these workflows. Sort of, I think of it as tools engineers. So just like in software development, you look at you have somebody that manages infrastructure around compute and things like that, making sure it has all the right packages installed. You've got somebody that's writing all the code to actually run an application, and then you have somebody that's sort of dealing with packaging and releases and things like that. You have a lot of different functions. So from a network automation standpoint, the only way you can be successful is to have all of the above from a skill set standpoint. And so whether you are, and for us as vendors, whether we're building an open source tool, a commercial tool, or an open core sort of model, your target customers are all of the above, because to be successful, there's a lot of constituencies and everybody's going to have to take on different pieces of that automation puzzle.
Excellent, excellent. Yeah, interesting question with this as to who the target customer is. Open source,
not easy.
Yeah.
It's everybody, isn't it? So
Yeah, in some sense, you get the network engineer who says, I'm just going to start playing with this on the side and starting to do some stuff, and then that whole thing blossoms, and then you look back and go, well, we spent a lot of money on that, and then we're going to switch over to this commercial product. Interesting choices going on there. So the next interesting question is, let's talk about the differences between extending an open source product. It's kind of a very your own sort of approach versus a commercial product where you get a package, and how are you going to expand that? So Brad, let's start with you on that one.
It's an interesting question. There's a couple different things that come to mind here in terms of extending open source tooling or extending your automation package. Have you found the need to extend it to add new capabilities to interact with a current platform you have, additional functionality within the scope of network automation, or do you need to extend it wide so you can interact with other infrastructure platforms? Right. So I think what's interesting here is we talk about how can I tweak it, how can I extend it? And it's not just in the capabilities that you need as a network engineer, it's can other teams use this platform? Can my virtualization team, can the server team, can the storage team use the same platform? So we're going wide with extending the platform. And I tend to think about, open source versus commercial, really, it can be a progression, right? You can author open source software, you can contribute to Ansible, you can do a pull request, and given the right testing, the right code base, the right documentation, that actually can become part of the commercial offering. So I don't think it's black and white here. I don't think it's one or the other. I think it's more of a can it be a transition from open source up into commercial? And we see that happen all the time with the community contributors. Yep,
absolutely. Daren?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. With obviously a project as large as Ansible, you're going to have, plenty of contributors and a solid maintenance base. Other open source projects may not be so lucky, right? I always think of the little ones where people get to use them, may want to do something about changing them, may not have the skills to actually make those changes and develop those changes, and then there may not be enough maintainers or contributors who would be able to do that. And so things could happen fast if someone's interested, and then not if they're not. So, I'm a little bit on the fence with this one. I guess it's similar in the sense of a commercial tooling, because again, commercial tools have roadmaps and features are requested and developed based on a customer requirement. So again, it's a similar kind of situation. I'm obviously from an organization a lot smaller than Red Hat, and our product is not as big a development team as Ansible, but we feel the pull in a very similar way. And I guess the way to do it is to work on building modularity and building plug-in capabilities and those sorts of things, so that you're able to allow people to develop very simply extensions to the base platform as far as you can. But then, of course, once it comes to features that are new features above and beyond, then we get into the realms of the complexity of the contributors. So.
Yeah, it's a real interesting caveat there. I think Brad really hit it there with, okay, so how do we expand this in breadth? Because, gosh, I need to tie this in my trouble ticketing system, ServiceNow, for example, or, and you're starting with just Ansible. All right, so how do I go about doing that? It's more about the entire workflow than it is about just automating the network. And that's a key thing.
I guess it comes then to understanding how you use APIs, and it comes back to some of the conversation earlier about being able to write scripts or environments that sit outside the base platform in order to extract information from one and pass it to the other, and have that transition. Right.
Okay, so you've started to take this path, and it's either open source or commercial products. How do you go about troubleshooting? And is it significantly different between an open source approach or a commercial product? Samir, let's go with you on this one.
I think ultimately the way you troubleshoot is no different. You've got two applications. You're going to leverage the documentation. You're going to leverage the people you're working with, whether it's the open source community that's supporting it or a particular vendor, to help them to help you troubleshoot something that's happening, whether that's something with the platform itself or that's something that it's uncovered about your network. So I don't think there's a big difference there. It's just a function of, at the end of the day, how well are these two pieces of software written, whether it's open or closed. It's like there's lots of well-written, robust open source platforms that are easy to interact with. And there's also lots of large commercial platforms that are poorly written that are hard to interact with. So I think it's just a function of how well is the software written, and then how good is the documentation. So I think those are sort of the key things. And I think regardless of what your business model is for the platform, I think you can achieve your goals of being easy to use, easy to troubleshoot in both commercial and open source models.
Yeah, I think the key thing there is that some of the commercial products need to make sure they have a way to collect the troubleshooting data. A lot of times it's built into the open source products because, well, that's what they had to use to develop the products.
Exactly.
So,
and that tooling's exposed to you, right? It's not hidden behind the scenes. It's like, whatever somebody wrote, we
exactly.
run a large open source project. Everything we use to debug is available to our users because, it's built in and it's just there as part of the code. So
all right,
it's easy
Mike?
from that standpoint.
Yeah, I'll just build off that quickly and say that, the challenge with automating networking is all the underlying variables. You're dealing usually with many different vendors, many different platforms. So, ultimately we see the situation where even kind of the best intended automated solution is going to have problems. You're ultimately going to end up in that situation. And it's absolutely critical. I can tell you with our product, a lot of the feature requests and implementations came around improved troubleshooting and logging and things like that. Now we've made a decision to have an always logging kind of capability on, where every interaction with every device is logged. So when you get a few failures out of thousands, you can hone in and see exactly what the cause was. And maybe you have to augment the way in which you're implementing that change. But I think that one of the challenges I see with open source is sometimes you need to instrument or code that instrumentation in yourself.
Right.
And sometimes when you're working with open source, it's a shorter path to just implement the change than implementing all the instrumentation around the change for the pre-check and the post-check. And one customer we work with said they push out a scripted change and they wait and they watch the operations SNMP polling for 15 minutes to see if they took anything down. That's not a very effective, feedback mechanism. So I think, troubleshooting is extremely important for both commercial and open source products. You need that, and it needs to be documented and consumable by operations.
Excellent, thank you. Well, we're getting close to the end here, so I'd like to do a round of summary thoughts. Samir?
I think, hopefully what people take away from this is, open source or commercial, it's really a function of your organization. I think everybody needs to look at, what capabilities they have in the organization to consume different technologies and different solutions. And also recognize that you might build your workflow, more than likely you're going to build your workflow out of a combination of all of the above, right? You're going to have some open source components, you're going to have some commercial components. And then either you're going to put it together or you're going to pay somebody to put it together. But really think about the organizational capabilities, because when you think about a network automation system, it is not scripts, right? So people need to stop thinking about automation in terms of I'm going to write a script or write a single playbook, because ultimately that's never going to be usable and scalable. It's about an end-to-end workflow. It's a change in how you operate your network, how you build your network, how you think about your network. And so you got to start with that and then figure out which of the problems you can take on and then take them off. And then there's a lot of tool options out there. Do your due diligence. Just like you compare two closed source vendors, commercial tools, compare open source and commercial in the same manner, because ultimately that's what you're paying for, an outcome. So make sure you evaluate it accordingly.
Right. Mike, let's go with you next.
Yeah, I would just say that, this conversation could scare people away from it. I would say, implementing automation orchestration in your organization can really bring agility and security and efficiency. So it's an endeavor well worth pursuing. What we see is, like, you got to tie in that executive sponsorship and get the projects funded, get things moving. Because if it's a science project, or one developer or one engineer taking on self-learning, it's not going to move the needle. Open source is tremendous. In fact, our product is built on thousands of open source components. So I think for the folks building software, open source is amazing. You can build software faster than ever. So that's great. But while we're a commercial solution, I'll say not all commercial solutions are created equally. So I think, because some have been around for a long time, some are not implementing modern technologies. We were talking a little bit about data modeling, and more modern approaches are working towards intent-based. So I think the key is to really understand, as you evaluate, are you looking at kind of consuming it as modern technology that can also be integrated programmatically. We touched a little bit on RESTful APIs. I think that's huge. My final closing comment would be, in your evaluation, tie it to a real problem, and a problem that if you solve with automation, it would pay for the effort or the product completely. I mean, there's a lot of cases where you could say if a product solved this problem, it would pay for itself. And I think that makes a useful evaluation and a strong ROI.
All right, Brad?
I would just say, when you're looking at these things, in terms of moving forward with network automation, start looking at your configurations and think about where the data comes from that makes up your config, right? We all look at our network device configurations in front of us. Where did that data come from? What is the source of truth for that data? And make sure that you find a platform that can harvest the data from its source. Because I think what we're all going to find is a lot of that configuration information, the network team doesn't own that. So you want a platform, you want tooling that can reach out to your CMDB, your ServiceNow database. It doesn't really matter where it is in the enterprise. And then the only other thing I would say is, and I'm going to follow up on I think what Mike was saying here, is it doesn't have to be scary. It's not scary, right? You can start doing network automation today. You can do it from your laptop. You can automate the work that you had been doing. You take baby steps, and then when you get to a point where you realize this is something that the enterprise can value from, then promote your automation off of your own laptop, your own tools, to an enterprise platform. That's a progression.
Okay. Thank you. Daren, let's wrap it up.
Yeah, I'm going to keep it short and sweet. I've got a customer who uses the terminology buy, borrow, build. And I think that fits with what everyone's been saying today, really. It's a question of, if it costs in and you can find a product that delivers the solution you need, buy it. If you need to borrow bits to build on it, to build stuff around it, go for it. If you have to build from scratch, then you have to build from scratch. But if you're going to do that, then you need someone with the skills and the development capability to do that. So I think it is that case of use whichever elements of that, bolt together in the most cost-effective way to deliver the solution. But it's all about, as the other guys have said, finding and understanding what the solution actually is before you start on your project.
Thank you. Thanks to our panelists, Samir, Mike, Brad, Daren. Certainly appreciate it. Your insights into the industry, and welcome. Hope that this conference, is certainly this track on automation, has helped everyone out there, and good luck in your automation efforts. Take care.
Sorry, thanks for hosting the panel. Definitely an exciting time to be in networking.
For sure.
May you live in exciting times, right?
Never a dull moment.
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you, folks. Take care.
Thanks, guys.
Take care. Thank you.